I'd like to quickly address the number one asset protection strategy, which is the biggest falsehood in the industry. The assets in your wife or partner's name are not safe assets. That's the number one misnomer, and they come to me and they say, oh yeah, but you don't want to sue me for insolvent trading. I don't have anything, everything's in my wife's name. It's just not the case. In circumstances, I want you to think about it like this. If all your assets are in your wife's name and you end up divorced, I'm sorry that I used the wife in this situation, but then most of you looking around the room, that's going to be the circumstances. If all your assets are in your wife's name and you get divorced, you're hardly going to throw your hands up in the air and walk away and go, well, I guess I'm just going to walk away with nothing because it's all in my wife's name. And that's the same situation that creditors, the company creditors are going to find themselves in. If the assets are in the wife's name, but the business has funded those assets, then the business has a claim on those assets. Similarly, if the unfortunate event that you floated through to becoming bankrupt, a bankruptcy trustee is also going to take a look at the assets acquired in the marital pool, and whilst 50% of it might flow aside when there's a separation, 50% of those assets would come back to you in a family law separation, so therefore 50% of those assets are potentially available for a liquidator who is seeking to pursue you. If they need to be enforced to get to those assets, they do so through bankruptcy. So in those circumstances, if you're wanting to avoid bankruptcy, it's really important to sit down and have a come to Jesus type discussion with an insolvency practitioner and your own advisors to protect you, because remember, the insolvency practitioner is there to protect the interests of creditors, to work out how to prevent us going down a pathway of major litigation and enforcing bankruptcy to get at those assets. There are much better asset protection strategies, guys, than putting things in your wife or partner's names, okay? You need to speak to advisors about things like discretionary trusts, self-managed super funds. There are heaps better ways to do this than sticking everything in your partner's name. Probably the number one reason that people put things specifically in their partner's names is because of the capital gains tax concessions for the family home being in your personal name, and that might well be justifiable, but further assets after that, you need to have a much more sophisticated and professionally established asset protection strategy if you want to make sure that those assets are beyond touch of a liquidator in the unfortunate circumstances that you might find yourself in. Lastly, guys, and this is a particular issue for your industry, the idea of setting up companies was designed to protect your personal financial position from the consequences of your businesses and potential business failures. Nonetheless, directors in your industry in particular, but everywhere, but especially in your industry, we find, are out there signing personal guarantees to secure supply and secure finance for the businesses that you need to run. An unfortunate reality of running a business in building and construction is the likelihood of you being able to trade a business without entering into any forms of personal guarantees is virtually non-existent. I have heard of some people that have found ways around it all. Fantastic, that's great. But the big reality is that the people that are lending you money to buy plant and equipment, or even just to get supply, are taking personal guarantees. And some of those suppliers have made it their major protection strategy for themselves is the intense enforcement of all personal guarantees, even if it is to the point of bankruptcy. Anyone who is in this room has dealt with Reese Plumbing knows that one way or another, Reese Plumbing gets every cent owed to them because they will sue you to the point of bankruptcy and hound you to the ends of the earth to get the money back under the personal guarantees that you've signed. You need to be aware of which of your suppliers and people have got personal guarantees, because it's a major issue in terms of when we get to the point of business stress and being able to restructure. You need to make sure that the terms of your personal guarantees are known, including how you go about revoking them. If you move on from a business, you need to be able to go to all the suppliers and revoke your personal guarantees in writing. If you do not, as one man I recently encountered, and this is technically related to me, found 5 years after he had ceased being the director of the company continued to acquire goods and services from a supplier, racked up $250,000. And that supplier was entitled to enforce that against my uncle as a personal guarantor, because they provided the goods to the company on the basis that they were secured under that personal guarantee. and nobody had revoked the personal guarantee. So even though he wasn't a director of the company, he still was up for the bill. Sure, that gives him a right to sue the company for the money he was forced to disgorge to the supplier, but he's the one who's now chasing down an insolvent company trying to get his money back, and he's just joined the pool of creditors. So be aware of the personal guarantees that you sign. Be aware that suppliers will try and slip personal guarantees into the terms and conditions that you sign when you enter into agreements. And remember that unless you have specifically signed a personal guarantee, then it's not real and it's not enforceable. So make sure you get proper legal advice about that. They usually should be a separate document, not just a term and condition within standard terms and conditions. Make sure you're aware of them and make sure you revoke them when the time comes to leave. You, in theory, can put a time limit into a personal guarantee. If someone asks you to sign a personal guarantee, you could potentially, if it wasn't there in the terms of it, you could write in and say that the personal, into it in hand and say the personal guarantee expires 12 months after it's signed. Whether or not the supplier will allow you to get away with that, that's a matter for your negotiations with them. But suffice to say, you certainly can add those terms in and then they might come back to you after 12 months and ask you to refresh it, or they might cease supplying. But it's effectively has been used, and 90% of small business restructures have been used by businesses to enter into debt write-off with the tax office. If you're negotiating with the tax office, they'll do a deal with you on interest and penalties. They will not do a deal with you on principal debt at this level. However, if you appoint a small business restructuring practitioner, after 20 days, we write a report to the creditor that says, there's an offer on the table here for 15, 20 cents in the dollar. In liquidation, you're getting nothing. Will you vote to approve taking 20 cents in the dollar for this one-off deal and full and final settlement of the debt? Now, 90% of all small business restructures at the moment, and there are hundreds going through every week at the moment, 90% of them, the ATO is the sole creditor for, and so they have the sole say in whether or not it gets up over the line. The ATO is generally speaking accepting 20 to 25 cents in the dollar at the moment for genuine compromise arrangements, but you only get one. You only get one. It is designed to be a one-off come to Jesus moment with the ATO where you get to clean up your balance sheet and make sure that you're able to then trade moving forward and keep up to date with your taxes. We don't interfere in the business, it completely stays in your hands, so therefore a lot of the intrusion of the voluntary administration regime is not there. It is worth discussing with your accountants. If you are in a rolling tax situation, the small business restructure might be something that is worth exploring. An ATO repayment arrangement is not resetting the date on which your taxes are due. What people don't tend to recognise is that an ATO repayment arrangement is an admission in writing that your company cannot pay its debts as and when they fell due. An ATO repayment arrangement is a financial agreement between you and the tax office that allows you to prevent the tax office from enforcing the debt against you. It is a deed of forbearance. If you do not comply with your repayment arrangement and the company ends up in liquidation, the ATO has to give the money back and they'll come to you to make you personally liable for it. It also uses the principal way in which we know when a company is insolvent. The date it entered into a repayment arrangement with the tax office is the date that it declared that it was insolvent. Yes, repayment arrangements are probably a viable option if you are taking on commitments that you genuinely can afford to catch up on tax debt. But if all you're doing is using a repayment arrangement to buy time, you're basically compounding down on your problems and personally exposing yourself. You need to protect yourself because you're in a very tough industry and increasing financial difficulties. And so I encourage you to know your business's financial position, speak with your advisors, and be honest with yourself about the problems that you're facing, because putting your head in the sand and pretending that things are not the way they are is the number one way that you end up losing personally. Guys, if there's ever anything that I can do as a sounding board for any of the issues that you might be facing, please don't hesitate to send me an email, and I'm always happy to have a chat. Thanks for your time.